British police are the best in the world. I don't believe one of these stories I've heard about them raiding gay bars for no reason at all, lining the customers up by the wall, picking out people, knocking them down, resisting arrest as they're kicked on the ground. I don't searching their houses and calling them queer, about them raiding gay bars for no reason at all. Happens lining the customers up by the wall. Don't have to be gay to sing on this song, but it helps. Sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Being a lesbian's wonderful fun. You ain't fit to mother a daughter or son. There's no nudes in Gay News, our last magazine, but they still find excuses to call it obscene. Read how disgusting we are in the press, the Evening News and the Sunday Express. Molesters of children, corrupters of youth. It's there in the paper, it must be the truth. So try and sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Have you heard the story about Peter Wells, who one day got arrested and dragged to the cells for being in love with a guy of 18? The vicar found out they'd been having a scene. The magistrate sent him for trial by the Crown. He even appealed, but they still sent him down. He was only mistreated a couple of years, 'cause even in prison they look after the queers. Better believe it. Sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. And sit back and watch as they close down our clubs, arrest us for meeting and raid all our pubs. Make sure your boyfriend's at least 21. And if you're a lesbian, don't be a mum. Lie to your workmates, lie to your folks. Put down the queens and tell anti-queer jokes. Gay lips ridiculous, join their laughter. The buggers are legal now. What more are they after? Sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. One more time. Sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy this way.
Wow. Welcome, everybody. It is now 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time, and all the other time zones that we are in. Hello and welcome. My name is Kieran, and I am here today from Toronto, or what is known as Toronto. I'm joined by my comrade Marianne.
Bonjour. Alors, moi...
Sorry, go ahead.
C'est ça, Marianne de Montréal. avec Kieran.
Yes. Unfortunately, most of our program is going to be in English. We are a bunch of Anglos we cannot help it, but we do hope that some of our program or some of our greetings and some of our transitional parts will be also in French. So thank you, Marianne, for joining us and for providing that. We also realize that simultaneous translation is pretty much, it's a huge deal. It's a big thing, and we haven't been able to have that today. But thank you for joining. Merci beaucoup. And some of us will try our hand at French to varying degrees of success. So today we are here to celebrate Pride. We are from the Pride Commission of the Communist Party of Canada. And today's program is called People's Recovery, Queer Liberation. And we are trying to discuss today the way that this entire society that we live in Canada as well as outside has been adversely affected by the pandemic as well as capitalism, which is actually the root of the problem, and how LGBTQIS2S people specifically have been affected and further marginalized, even among the people who are marginalized within the working class of Canada as well as the world. So first, I'd like to invite Marianne and Jennifer to do a land acknowledgement before we proceed.
Certainly. I'll start with the English land acknowledgement, and then Marianne can translate it for the French folks joining us today. So we are meeting here today from all parts of the country, but wherever we are located, we are on the lands of Indigenous peoples who were the first peoples here in the northern half of Turtle Island. In every part of Canada, the state of Canada, these territories were taken by the colonialists and then by the Canadian capitalist state for the profits of the big corporations which exploit all working people and lands. This is true where unfair treaties were signed under duress and usually later ignored or violated against the interests of the Indigenous nations. This is equally true in regions where these nations have never signed treaties or surrendered their traditional and ancestral territories, which remain the unceded homelands of Indigenous peoples. Wherever we work and live in this country, we always give our thanks and respect to the original owners whose lands we are on and meeting here today. As communists, we defend the right of all Indigenous people across the world to the self-determination of their nations and national sovereignty. And we continue the struggle for the recognition of Indigenous rights and Indigenous self-determination as part of our political work. We also understand that no queer liberation can happen without the liberation of Indigenous peoples and the whole working class across the lands.
Bonjour tout le monde. Alors effectivement, je vais faire un petit peu d'introduction en français. Donc, je l'ai dit tantôt, je m'appelle Marianne, je vais présenter avec Kieran. Puis peut-être pour faire un peu le point, donc aujourd'hui, nous sommes réunis pour discuter de la libération des personnes queer dans le contexte de la crise du système capitaliste. En particulier, on sait que toutes les personnes de la communauté ont été particulièrement affectées dans le contexte de la crise sanitaire. Nous vivons déjà toutes sortes de marginalisation à différents niveaux. Bien entendu, la crise sanitaire ne fait qu'accentuer ces situations. Alors, quelle est la perspective pour sortir de la crise actuelle? Comment on voit la relation entre le système hétérosexiste et la libération pour le socialisme et notre perspective, en fait, sur cette libération-là. Alors, c'est ce que nous allons discuter aujourd'hui pour vous informer. Toutes les personnes qui sont en ce moment présentatrices sont des membres de la commission Pride du Parti communiste. Nous sommes tous des militants et militantes queer. La présentation va bien sûr être principalement en anglais. On va pardonner à mes collègues camarades d'être tous des anglos. On les excuse, mais je vais quand même offrir un peu de traduction là, pour les personnes qui seraient francophones puis qui aimeraient discuter ou se joindre avec nous. N'hésitez pas à utiliser le chat si vous avez des questions. Si vous voulez vous exprimer en français également, je peux traduire les interventions. Donc, c'est ça, alors on va essayer un peu de... Tout ne sera pas traduit par contre, là, malheureusement. Et je pense que c'est important, comme ça a été mentionné, de reconnaître le territoire sur lequel nous sommes. Et en ce moment, nous sommes en provenance de toutes les régions du pays, mais nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Où que nous soyons, nous sommes sur les terres des peuples autochtones qui étaient les premiers peuples ici, sur cette moitié de l'île, cette moitié nord de l'île de la Tortue. Toutes les régions du Canada sont des territoires qui ont été saisis par les colonialistes, puis par l'État canadien capitaliste au profit des grandes entreprises qui exploitent tous les travailleurs et toutes les travailleuses. C'est le cas lorsque les traités inéquitables ont été signés sous la contrainte et généralement ignorés ou violés par la suite contre les intérêts des nations autochtones. Cela est également vrai dans les régions où ces nations n'ont jamais signé de traités ni abandonné leurs territoires traditionnels et ancestraux, qui demeurent des territoires non cédés appartenant aux peuples autochtones. En tant que communistes, partout où nous travaillons et vivons dans ce pays, nous remercions et respectons les propriétaires légitimes des terres sur lesquelles nous nous trouvons en ce moment. Nous sommes solidaires des luttes pour protéger les terres et les cours d'eau, pour obtenir une véritable justice et pour la liberté et la vérité. En tant que communistes, nous revendiquons le droit de tous les peuples autochtones du monde entier à l'autodétermination de leur nation et à leur souveraineté nationale. Nous poursuivons la lutte pour la reconnaissance des droits autochtones et à l'autodétermination autochtone dans le cadre de notre travail politique. C'est pourquoi nous le signons aujourd'hui dans le contexte d'une activité sur la libération queer. Nous comprenons également qu'aucune libération queer ne sera réelle sans la libération des peuples autochtones et sans la libération de toute la classe ouvrière. Sur ce, j'aimerais passer le micro à Kieran.
Merci beaucoup, Marianne. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jennifer, for that. So today we are joined by some of our colleagues and comrades from the Pride Commission of the Communist Party of Canada. We are a group of within the Communist Party of Canada that comprises of various people, and we are a pretty diverse group. We are going to be talking today about things like housing, homelessness, joblessness, unemployment, and all kinds of issues that people in the front lines are facing, as well, specifically how these things show up for LGBTQIS2S people. Marianne, do you have anything to add? What is something that you want to gather from today's event?
Bien, merci beaucoup, Kieran. Oui, je pense que effectivement, moi, j'ai très hâte d'entendre la discussion. Puis peut-être avant de commencer, j'avais peut-être envie de vous communiquer une bonne nouvelle qui vient du Québec. Parce que, bon, vous savez, des fois, ça fait du bien après toutes les mauvaises nouvelles qu'on reçoit un peu partout. Où, on a parlé de notre marginalisation dans le contexte de la COVID. Mais en fait, c'est qu'ici, il y a 2 semaines, il y a quand même un jugement important qui est passé. C'est une petite victoire queer. C'est le juge Grégory Moore de la Cour supérieure qui a invalidé 5 articles du Code civil du Québec qui violaient les droits à la dignité et l'égalité des personnes trans et non-binaires. Donc, désormais, les personnes non citoyennes auront le droit de changer leur nom et leur mention de sexe, ce qu'on ne pouvait pas faire avant. Les personnes non-binaires pourront également choisir une option autre sur leur document officiel. Mais bien sûr, là, il y a un projet de loi qui s'en vient où on va pouvoir détailler les modalités de ces nouveaux changements. Les parents trans qui ont fait une transition avant la naissance de leur enfant pourront enfin avoir le droit de changer leur désignation parentale sur le certificat de naissance de leur enfant, ce qui n'était pas encore le cas. Et aussi, les personnes non-binaires pourront indiquer simplement « parents ». Donc, on n'aura plus la dualité mère-père. Et finalement, les jeunes personnes trans n'auront plus l'obligation d'obtenir une attestation d'un professionnel de la santé qui confirme que leur démarche de transition était justifiée, ce qui était complètement absurde. Alors, c'est une victoire juridique, bien sûr, c'est limité. Concrètement, ça ne ressort pas de la crise. Et on va parler aujourd'hui plus de ce qui nous sort réellement de la crise et des stratégies concrètes qu'on a. Mais ça montre quand même qu'il y a une évolution des perspectives et des mentalités, qu'il y a une certaine reconnaissance des violences hétérosexistes dans toutes les sphères de nos vies. Et bien sûr, les cours de justice ne prennent pas des décisions en dehors du contexte social et c'est nous qui sommes les sources principales collectivement de ces changements-là du contexte social. Alors, je pense que ça donne peut-être une petite bonne nouvelle avant de commencer notre panel, notre conférence.
Merci, Marianne, merci. Thank you so much. And now I would like to turn the program over to our first speakers, Jen and Stephen, who are going to be talking about housing and jobs. So Jen and Stephen, please come on and introduce yourselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jen. I also go by Moxie, she, her pronouns. I am a member of the Communist Party of Canada, and I'm a part of the Public Sector Workers Club. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee, the colonial territory of Treaty 13, and is also known as Takaranto, the dish with one spoon, the colonial name of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today I'm going to speak with you a little bit about the housing crisis, mostly in Canada. It's going to be kind of a high level overview of what's going on and how it uniquely relates to LGBTQIQ2S folks. And lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, intersex, queer questioning, and two-spirited. So you're going to hear that acronym a lot, and that's the definition. So please pardon my French translation, but I am going to make an effort for our French comrades here today to speak French. Bonjour, mon nom est Jen Moxie, LL. Je suis membre du Parti communiste du Canada, au Club des travailleurs du secteur public. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel des Huron-Wendat, Mississauga et Haudenosaunee, le territoire colonial des traites d'histoire, ses plats et connus comme Takaranto, les plats avec un coulier, les noms coloniaux de Toronto sur le Canada. Aujourd'hui, je vais parler un peu de la crise de l'augmentation à l'égard des travailleurs LGBTQIQ2S. So thank you for helping me through that. Bye. Okay. So today, again, I just wanted to really do a high level, housing is a major crisis in Canada and globally, actually, but in Canada right now. And there's a lot to talk about around housing. We could do like a whole, 2 hours on it. But just to give you a little bit of a breakdown, I'm just going to open a little bit with some global stats here. First of all, when we talk about homelessness, we mean a place with no warm bed to sleep in, especially if it's minus 40. We mean unsafe, abusive, and exploitive housing situations. We mean fear of eviction. We mean nowhere to permanently plan out your social life or even be able to access basic things like food and water. Generally speaking, homelessness is defined by 3 key aspects. So homelessness is people without any accommodation at all, street of all people living in temporary or crisis accommodation, sometimes called couch surfing, and people living in severely inadequate, insecure, or unsafe housing. Excuse me. And as communists, of course, we know that housing is absolutely a fundamental human right and is the basis and foundation for a healthier life, not just for individuals, but for the whole of society. But for many LGBTQIQ2S people within the working class, housing is increasingly becoming inaccessible. Globally, the capitalist system favors this profit over people economic mandate. Housing is a commodity. This results in over 100 million homeless individuals and at least 1.5 billion people living in inadequate housing around the world. Multiple studies have shown that LGBTQIQ2S people are more likely to be homeless than non-LGBTQIQ2S people. We comprise an estimated 20 to 40% of homeless populations globally, but only compromising 5 to 10% of the wider population of the working class in general. So those are pretty staggering numbers if we just did that, brief overview. So bringing it back here to Turtle Island, Canada, some general kind of overview in Canada is that really Canada's homeless crisis, the way we know it today, pretty much emerged in the 1980s. And we all know what the 1980s was about. It was like huge austerity, defunding and divesting in a lot of social programs. And one of those social programs, of course, was a massive divestment in affordable and public housing. So there was a lot of political shifts in the economy at that time. And generally speaking, all kinds of social supports were divested from. Before COVID-19, 35,000 people across Canada experienced some form of homelessness in any given night. That translates to over 235,000 people a year. That is unacceptable. It's ridiculous. Canada is an extremely cold country, and people literally die in the streets. This isn't acceptable. Another 1.5 million people pay more than 40% of their income on housing. And the average cost of housing across, this is averaged across Canada. Of course, it's more in the larger urban centers, but the average cost across Canada is $1,100 a month for one single bachelor unit. But meanwhile, close to 40% of the LGBTIQ2S people over the age of 15 make only $20,000 a year on average, and that's taken from Stats Canada. And the cost of living index indicates that most Canadians need an average of $2,300 a month to live a decent standard of life. So some unique aspects around housing and homelessness and how that particularly impacts the LGBTIQ2S working class. The commodification of housing, discrimination, a lack of family and social supports, and a lack of reasonable and decent employment and income opportunities in general put our population at a greater risk for homelessness. And those are just some of the factors. The estimated homeless population is 2 to 3 times as many within our community of the LGBTIQ2S than that of cisgendered and non-LGBTIQ workers. Youth being particularly impacted. In Canada, 1 out of every 3 homeless youth identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. One example of some unique indicators for homelessness among our community is the idea of not having a safe place to live, a life free of violence. 34% of LGBT youth are more likely to say that violence or abuse made them leave home, compared to heterosexual or cisgender youth, which is only 16%. So clearly, sexual orientation is a factor for unsafe housing conditions. Once these youth are on the streets, they face additional discrimination, finding work, social acceptance, accessing education, et cetera, which I mentioned above. We all know that without a safe place to live or acceptance into a society, alienation increases all kinds of other health risks for other health issues. The risks for substance abuse go way up. The risk for extra violence, the risk for falling into really exploitive work like prostitution, that increases. Physical and psychological illnesses increase, and just generally your health is deteriorates at a much faster rate when you have issues with homelessness. Incarceration is another indicator for people who are homeless. They tend to be mental health, and homeless individuals tend to take up a lot of space within our justice system, our horrible, in a like just awful justice system. And of course, suicide is another huge factor for all of these indicators. Stats Canada validates, although there is no major data set yet available to to illuminate the full breadth of the experiences within our community, Canadians during the time of COVID-19 pandemic, excuse me, I just misread all of that. Basically, there's not a lot of data to really look at the time of COVID, like right now. What is our community experiencing during this pandemic? So we have all of this existing data set. So we know that because of the existing data set that I just did a high level on, those pervasive inequalities around housing, financial insecurity are exacerbated during this time of the pandemic. An additional pandemic stressor is the risk for eviction. We know that millions of Canadians are facing eviction right now, and thousands have already been evicted from the lack of government support for low-income renters and workers who have lost their jobs. These mass evictions make the existing emergency shelter system even more strained, resulting in growing outdoor tent encampments. Even during the time of below freezing conditions, people are sleeping in tents in parks throughout the country. The impact on LGBTIQ2S seniors is also extremely significant. Before the pandemic, the LGBTIQ2S seniors have been forced back into isolation and the so-called closet due to discrimination and poverty in general. But it's even more concerning that our seniors, when they are having to go into long-term care homes, they're facing even more discrimination and more alienation within those care nursing home settings. During the pandemic, we all know that seniors living in long-term care homes are currently very particularly under threat from being exposed to the virus. So there's not only more of an isolation risk, there's also an increased health risk. In Canada, the hardest hit areas of the pandemic have been within private for-profit long-term care nursing homes. In this past year, thousands of elders and seniors have died throughout Canada's long-term care homes due to the pandemic. This also emphasizes the need to take these private for-profit care homes and put them under social and public control. Our current governments are not addressing the pandemic and homelessness crisis, which deeply impacts the LGBTIQ2S community. Recently, the Ontario government implemented 2 bills, a so-called solution to the pandemic housing and health crisis, Bill 184 and Bill 175. And just a really quick overview for those 2 bills so people understand. Bill 184 is supposedly called Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing. So this bill actually has been renamed by tenants themselves as the Mass Eviction Bill. The new rules allow for immediate eviction orders should a tenant default on any repayment agreements that they made with their landlord due to COVID. And it's also retroactive and applies to all other repayment agreements that happened at the beginning of the pandemic. This is not a housing protection bill at all. Then we have Bill 175, which is Connecting People to Home and Community Care Act. This bill essentially allows for further privatization of home care, long-term care. Further privatization will mean reduced services for vulnerable people requiring home care, including the LGBTIQ2S population. So I like to always bring in a little bit of solution, and the Communist Party of Canada has always recognized housing as a human right and basic need. We want a people's recovery around housing. So, for instance, our party in Ontario is launching a new housing campaign to support those who struggle against a brutal capitalist system that throws people and family into the street during a pandemic, because that's what's happening, people. That's what's happening. So we are demanding, as the Communist Party of Ontario, Canada, that there's an immediate repeal of Bill 184, extend the ban on evictions and foreclosures, and place all units, including vacant ones, under rent control to eliminate the 2-tier system. Our party is also calling for a ban on rent evictions, implementing a system of rent rollback so that tenants pay only 20% of their household income on rent. And we're also calling for a reversal of the government's policy on vacancy decontrol, which incentivizes landlords to kick out tenants and hike up the rent prices. And that happens a lot. And we are also calling for making long-term care homes publicly owned and take them out of the hands of profiteers. So that's just a little bit around the housing situation for the whole of the working class, and of course, how it specifically impacts the LGBTIQ2S community. So my comrade Stephen is going to sort of expand a little bit on some of the income inequality and job issues within our community. So take it away, Stephen. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Jan, I love how you present this, because it's like, okay, I have nothing left to say.
Oh,
but
yes, you do. You always have something to say.
In lieu of everything I was going to say.
But Stephen, you also do a lot of work with the global issues.
Global
around
thingy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The global thingy around LGBTIQ2S.
I'm into the global thingy. So that, comme Jen, je parle aujourd'hui de Toronto, où reste plus de 40 000 Inuits, Métis et peuples autochtones. Ici, le mouvement de Landback est vraiment robuste. Je suis membre de SCFP, QP, le plus grand syndicat de Canada, et en Québec aussi, je pense, le deuxième à Québec. Je suis membre du conseil d'administration de ILGA, la seule fédération internationale d'organismes LGBTQ qui lutte contre la violence et la discrimination de l'État contre personnes de LGBTQ. Mon propre syndicat est l'une de les 1679 organismes, membres organismes de l'ILGA, dont 164 pays. C'est incroyable. My syndicat, my union, is one of these 1,679 member organizations of ILGA in 164 countries. Many other unions supporting the working class and the workplace as queers. I'm a member of the party's Central Committee and the Pride Commission. Here in Ontario, I'm a member of the Public Sector Workers Club with Jen, and I sit on our Provincial Pride Commission, again with Jen. In fact, Jen and I are like married, basically, in the party.
We're often together. Yeah.
Very often, which is a good thing. So, Jen, there is actually a recent study which shows that homelessness and unemployment are disproportionately affecting queer youth during the pandemic.
Stephen,
yeah.
Sorry, could you move your mic a little bit up? It's there's a lot of
staticky.
Yeah, it's I think where it's hitting your chin. Okay, thank you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Better.
That's
yes, much better. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So this study showed that, and it was just a couple of months ago, it actually shows that queer youth particularly are without access to basic needs, no surprise. Food and shelter, as we've seen, is a big problem. This focused completely on the queer community, and particularly on queer youth. The study was commissioned by a lead ILGA member group here in Canada, EGAL. So my other thoughts here are that the obvious, queer members of the working class have taken like a huge hit since COVID-19 began rolling out. But rolling across the country and particularly across workplaces. Of course, overall, racialized queers are the most impacted by the pandemic. More Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the 2S LGBTIQ communities already live with underlying health conditions, physical and mental disabilities, compared to both the queer community at large and, of course, the general population. So as working class comrades, we know there are a whole lot of queers working in the service sector, hotel industry, all kinds of services to the public. Young workers are, of course, usually part-time workers in precarious jobs. A whole bunch of them are queer. They're the last to be hired, the first to be fired. Job loss during the pandemic has hit these service sector workplaces like no other. For workers who are young and poor and queer, oh, what a dimension. So it's been devastating to this whole component of queer workers. In my own union alone, 10,000 public sector jobs have been lost. Those workers have been laid off. For example, 3,000 Air Canada workers and Bombardier workers who are members of both Unifor and CUPE, two unions, have been laid off in this month alone. Overall, Statistics Canada now reports that 10.6% of Canadian workers are unemployed. I'd like to say that not just 10% of those are queer, a whole bunch more in terms of percentages. So 10.6 Canadian. In Quebec, 13%. Atlantic, 12%. Ontario, 11. BC, 10. There are more than 9 million workers have applied for COVID emergency wages, CERB, but 2.7 million workers will be worse off after the CERB wages run out. And these will be, of course, low wage earners who already had too few hours of work before the pandemic. And a whole bunch of this group of workers, and just to keep repeating, are queer. So no surprise here. But at the same time, workers, and especially young queer workers, have been scrambling just to survive. Grocery chains, grocery store chains at the same time, Provigo, Metro, have been accumulating massive profits. And some of the big owners of these grocery store chains, like Weston Corporation, for example, itself has raked in several $billions in just the last 3 months. The truth is that government funds are actually subsidizing this kind of low wage work. In fact, COVID emergency wages are encouraging employers not to give anyone a raise, like no big surprise. For young two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and gender diverse people, the pandemic has created an environment where basic human rights enshrined in international law are further violated. According to the Survey of Safety in Public and Private Spaces, already in 2018, 21% of queer youth were reporting to have to live with family and friends because they had no other place to stay. And too often, these workers are stuck in quarantine now with homophobic and transphobic friends and family. So during COVID-19, a huge number of queer youth have had no other choice but to find a way to leave home. These are the people who are homeless, living in the street, scrambling for like a couple of hours of work. Interestingly, ILGA, the World Federation, has also reported on the loss of safe spaces. they also see this on an international level. The
Stephen,
losses, yes.
sorry, could you please move your mic again? It's against your cheek. That's what's, I think, causing the static. If you could move it away. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we should have had a rehearsal, obviously. Anyway, thanks for your patience, everyone. So ILGA has reported on all of this, like for marginalized LGBT workers during the pandemic around the world. Legal rights and protections, especially of trans people, are of course impossible at the best of times. We've seen an increase, ILGA, in violence, particularly targeting a young trans woman, young gender diverse people of color, and young LGBTIQ migrants and refugees who, who often can't access either mainstream service provision or specialist support that's required in terms of health and other needs. With increased demand but limited access, queer young people around the world are struggling with poor mental health and they're left with no supports. In Europe, ILGA Europe has recently reported on COVID-19 impacts. 7 areas that they've examined found these like huge impacts for queer people. Health and access to health, hate speech by political and religious leaders, sometimes governments, domestic violence, access to public relief programs, including housing, food, and subsistence, access to justice, registration, and other legal process, ability of LGBTIQ organizations to do advocacy and engage with policymakers. No surprise there. Is it encouraging that we're not alone? This is everywhere in the world and probably more severe in certain parts of the world, like ILGA Asia, which has recently released a study focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on mental health, especially for young queers living with HIV across Asia and the Pacific, where 60% of all LGBT youth are in self-quarantine and 36% now are in complete lockdown. The good news is that here in Canada, we have a plan. The Communist Party has a way to map out a non-capitalist route to recovery. Our main task here as communists is basically to ditch the scam of channeling our taxes to corporate recovery while building a future for all of us. That's the alternate plan. And all of us includes queer members of the working class. So here's the thing. Just last year, the federal government's own auditors found $553 billion in the public treasury, mostly unspent money from the Defense Department. This alone would easily pave for people's recovery from the current crisis. And you can find this by Googling People's Voice magazine. So examples are a federal childcare program charging $8 a day. This would allow women to re-enter the workforce. Job creation, including job creation for young and queer and women workers. The elimination of student debt, especially this is particularly important for post-secondary education, where it would only cost $30 billion to actually do that, which if you've got $500 billion, like, why not? The introduction of universal pharmacare would be possible, and that's what we're proposing. The construction of 1 million social housing units for workers over the next 10 years, that sure would help us all. 100% employment insurance is what we as communists are calling for as part of this people's recovery for everyone without any delay, not waiting 3 months, and generally increase social assistance payments. Each of these 6 reforms I've just mentioned, if enacted, would directly assist queer workers recover and engage in building a socialist path forward in Quebec and across Canada. And I'm sorry to go on so long, but thank you for participating today. It's been great.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. That was great. Both of you, from Jen and Stephen, thank you very much. So if you are watching this YouTube broadcast, please remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel that you're watching right now. So feel free to subscribe. That's the Communist Party channel. There's lots of other videos that we put up, that the Communist Party puts up, that are very educational and useful. So please remember to subscribe to the channel. You can also like the video. It's going to help show that video to other people. So if you can, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks. Next, we're going to have Marianne speak right now. Go ahead, Marianne.
Oui, mais je voulais juste dire, effectivement, comme l'a dit Kiran, aimez notre channel. On a beaucoup de choses qui sont sur le site YouTube du parti. Donc, il n'y a pas seulement des vidéos en anglais. Donc, si vous étiez des personnes francophones, il y a également du contenu francophone qui se publie. Puis, vous pouvez communiquer dans le chat aussi là, si vous avez des questions.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Next, we are going to be hearing from Chris Fraser. Chris, please come on and tell us all about yourself and what you have to say today.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to everybody. I don't know if I can't see myself. All right, there I go. All right, my name is Chris Fraser, and I'm joining this podcast from Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and current territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Canada, so which have never been ceded or surrendered. I'm a professor of history at St. Francis Xavier University in Nantigonish, and have been a member of the Communist Party for a little bit longer than 40 years. Whoops, I'm trying to manipulate my stuff here. All right. Anyways, I was a leader of the YCL, the Young Communist League, in the late 1980s, and have served in several leadership bodies of the Communist Party. I'm a queer activist and a drag performer, and my queer activism is mainly centered here in Mi'kma'ki, and particularly in my workplace and in the community that I live in. Later at the end of this broadcast, I'm going to be posting a link to a drag show that I organize, and it's for this evening. And it'll just give you a bit of a small taste of some of the strategies and tactics that we use here to try and build community around which we organize politically. So, en français, je m'appelle Chris Fraser et je vis en Mi'kma'ki, le territoire traditionnel et actuel du peuple Mi'kmaq, des terres qui n'ont jamais été cédées. Je suis professeur d'histoire à l'Université de Saint-FX d'Antigonish et je suis membre du Parti communiste depuis 40 ans. J'étais le chef de la YCL ou LGC à la fin des années 1980. Et j'ai servi dans les organes de direction du parti. Je suis une activiste queer et une artiste de drag. I also will say that I identify as trans and genderqueer, so that's my queer identities. I'm going to try and keep my remarks as short as I possibly can, and still try and say something of substance before the end of it. In any event, what I hope to do is to talk just a little bit about the notion or the struggles for queer liberation and what we mean by that. So I'll do a little bit of history, and I also want to talk about the need today for the continuing to build a political movement of queer people for their liberation. And certainly within the context of the pandemic and the economic crisis that is not the result of the pandemic, but is certainly aggravating the consequences of the pandemic. I think a little bit about a conversation I had with a young queer friend in Halifax, who has been working in the service industry, specifically at Starbucks, actually. And this is really common for especially a lot of queer young people to work in low-wage service industry jobs. And their Starbucks just recently closed, along with another number of Starbucks in Halifax. And they're quite concerned about how they're going to get by. And this is just such a common predicament these days, and it's hitting the younger people in our community particularly hard. And I think to myself, when I hear these stories, all this talk about Canada having decriminalized homosexuality, and all this talk about we're liberated, and I think we aren't liberated. We aren't liberated if we're continue to be subject to exploitation and workplace oppressions, and particularly as queer people. So there is a real need for a struggle for our liberation. And especially in our current situation of pandemic, mass unemployment, evictions, homelessness, and the list goes on and on. But if we're going to struggle successfully in defending ourselves as queer workers, queer young people, then it's really important that we understand the nature of the oppression that we face. And so I just want to begin by making a couple of comments in that respect. And we'll say that our oppression as queer people has its roots in private property, the relations of private property, and in the centrality of the nuclear family. And as one of the principal instruments, especially for capitalists, to accumulate private property and wealth, and retaining that wealth through inheritance by one's descendants. And this has had all kinds of consequences over the millennia for queer people. I often make a point that our oppression is intimately connected to the oppression of women and the function of misogyny in our society, and that our liberation will not happen without that also happening. So we're linked. Our struggles for liberation are absolutely linked. The rise of property, private property, and the nuclear family really has been a means of ensuring the legitimacy of one's descendants as the recipients of whatever surplus wealth you have managed to accumulate. And at the end of the day, this always boils down to laws under a class system that one way or another ensure male control over women's bodies in order to guarantee the legitimacy of the transfer of wealth to one's offspring. So how does this lead to the oppression of queers? Well, this is the logic of patriarchy. And it leads to the assertion constantly that legitimate, and we hear this from the religious right all the time, and this is where this comes from, that legitimate procreation, that is to say procreation within the bounds of legal marriage as defined within a capitalist system, is really the only permissible reason for sexual activity. So this makes us as queer folk outlaws. We're literally outside the law, because it's a small step from asserting that core principle of patriarchy to the saying that queer sexualities and identities undermine that assumption of what constitutes legitimate procreation, legitimate relationships, and the sanctity of the nuclear family. Now, we've seen some changes around this recently. You know, Canada's got legalization of gay marriage and so on, but it really hasn't changed the essence of that system. It's pretty superficial, and it has not done very much for the vast majority of queers who are not middle class, who are not cisgendered, and have a queer sexuality. Okay. So yes, we'll continue with this now. So what I want to get at is that there is an economic basis for the oppression of queers, our context today, and this is what we need to get at. I will also say one of the unique features about the rise of capitalism and the way that it has criminalized queers is that it is the dynamics, the expansion of capitalism through colonialism and then imperialism that has made the oppression of queers a truly global phenomenon. And I'll just point to the experiences, for example, of Christian missionaries systematically suppressing and persecuting queer people in the lands that they colonized as Europeans. And so we see this in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, as well as on the European continent. So the struggle for our liberation. Historically, this has moved in, I think, what Lenin would have called zigzags or advances and then retreats. It may surprise you to know that one of the very first examples of decriminalization of homosexuality actually happened in revolutionary France in 1791, which adopted a criminal code predicated on the belief that private acts by private individuals were not a matter for state intervention. And this included blasphemy, witchcraft, heresy, sacrilege, and sodomy. All of these were omitted from French law and subsequently decriminalized. And this made the 1791 Penal Code in revolutionary France the first Western law to actually decriminalize same-sex sexual activity since classic antiquity. The thing is, this did not really lead to a golden era of any kind of queer liberty, but it did curb the worst excesses of the law and provided a basis for the creation of the decriminalization in the Napoleonic Code of 1804. And I've come to this point because the Napoleonic Code, which decriminalized homosexual activity, that was then widely adopted across Europe, including parts of the German Confederation. This matters because when Germany becomes unified as a state around 1871, this coincides with the triumph of the bourgeois nation state, but also at the same moment as the defeat of the workers' uprising in Paris in the Commune. And at that very moment is one of the first acts of the newly unified Germany was to suppress the Napoleonic Code and to introduce paragraph 175, which recriminalized homosexuality. And paragraph 175, if you don't know, was the law that was subsequently revised by the Nazis and used to put tens of thousands of queer people into prisons and concentration camps for the duration of the war. There were other tendencies as well, and not very well known is the impact of the Russian Revolution and the decision of the Bolsheviks to actually decriminalize homosexuality in 1922, which was then revoked in 1934. But there is a struggle that has been going on both in socialist societies to come to grips with the liberation of queer people, but also within capitalism. Closer to home, after the Second World War, we saw a period of the Cold War and the rise of the Red Scare, which also had a Pink Scare component to it. And in Canada, what this involved was a systematic persecution of queer people in both the civil service and the military, including the use of detecting devices known as the fruit machine, which was used to ferret out secret homosexuals in the Canadian state and to discharge them from service to the state. Well, the very famous moment in 1969 when the Justice Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, announced that they were decriminalizing homosexuality actually never did happen. Really, all that happened at that moment was a decision not to enforce certain provisions of the criminal code. So, nevertheless, we got in 2019 a whole lot of celebrations and coins celebrating decriminalization. And I'm just going to make the point that it still has not happened, that except for 2 or 3 laws, gross indecency, buggery, and indecent assault on a male, which were all repealed eventually in the 1980s. Every single law that has ever been used in Canada to oppress, to jail, to criminalize queer people remains on the books. So what this means is that we do not have a permanent state of liberation, if at all. And there really has not been very much done to ensure that the material conditions that are necessary for liberation actually happens. And that is, at the end of the day, having a place to live, having a livable income, having work, and having social programs that will support you in your daily needs throughout the course of your life. So this is all about making the case for the ongoing necessity to create and build a liberation movement that will actually merge with the struggle of the working class to create a socialist society here in Canada. And for me, this is why I'm in the Communist Party. For me, this is why I'm a queer in the Communist Party, and why I struggle as a queer communist to create a better society in this country. Anyways, I'm going to park it all there, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Woo! Yes. Thank you to all of our speakers. Amazing, incredible research and insights that you all have brought and your analysis. So we are going to be holding what we're calling a queer NA, or a Q&A, but a queer NA. And we are going to be taking questions, good questions, valid, legitimate questions, not, trolling. But if you have questions for our speakers, please do share them in the YouTube chat. We also, Chris, that was an amazing, you really put in a very succinct way, in a few minutes, a rather long history of queer struggle. What do you think, what do you think of the idea of rainbow capitalism? How does that, because I feel like a lot of people kind of tend to feel that, we have arrived because we have, some of the CEOs of the world are queer, are gay, or gay people are running in for office and things like that. So how does that tie into what we're talking about today?
Well, the reality of queer capitalism, or rainbow capitalism, if you want to call it that, is that it all it does is allow entry into a rather elite club for a few members of the LGBTQ2SIA community, but certainly there's not enough room under rainbow capitalism for all of us to have a luxurious lifestyle. We're also going to get exploited under rainbow capitalism. That's just the logic of the system. So the surface of the system gets changed, but the realities of it do not. And one of the best examples I can think of this is the behavior of certain corporations and financial institutions during Pride celebrations. So you get Toronto Dominion, or you get various other corporations that go all out to make sure they have a presence during Pride parades and so on and so forth. This is just really affordable advertising for corporations. And what they're making a pitch to is a really privileged substratum of the LGBTQ2SIA community. That is to say, mainly white, mainly male, mainly cisgendered individuals who have disposable income are now going to be spending it at these preferred corporations who have this image of being really queer friendly. I guarantee you, when push comes to shove, all of that will get dumped, okay? And we're going to find ourselves in lineups, looking for houses, looking for jobs, and at food banks, which is actually where a good chunk of our community is at anyway. So we have rainbow capitalism, but it isn't doing the job to solve problems for the oppressed and exploited members of our community. So, yeah. Nice idea, maybe not at all, actually.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jen, you have something to chime in?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I wanted to just make a note of, the idea of like we have these this sort of privileged economic privilege within the LGBTIQ2SA community. So of course we have racial privilege. We have all these different intersections of, and I'm using privilege for a lack of a better word right now, but around, like I can see right in Toronto, in certain neighborhoods in Toronto, we have the gayborhood, for instance, and it is being heavily gentrified by kind of these rainbow capitalist queers that are actually like oppressing other more marginalized folks within the queer community and pushing us out onto the outskirts and not being inclusive and not having any kind of social cohesion around economic struggles and solidarity around more poorer queers too. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I hate seeing that because it's just another example of like we're all these sort of subgroups within the working class. We're always struggling against the hegemonic kind of overarching structure that is imposing a lot of different forms of oppression on us. And yeah, so Chris, that was so good. I learned so much from that talk. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
But I mean, we could talk like forever around rainbow capitalism, and same with pinkwashing too is another, really frustrating, oppressive concept as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have a question from the audience, so we can already start with our Q&A section. So this question, basically, it's a good question, and I think all the speakers can take their time to address it. So the person is asking if the speakers could be more direct and point out the links between queer people and workers' consciousness or Marxism for that matter. But why should LGBTQ people, I mean, for us, maybe it's really obvious, but I think for people who have not thought about these things, who identify as LGBTQ, why should they be attracted to Marxism? I guess that might be the question. Who wants to take that on first? Chris, go ahead. You're muted, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually just wanted to refer to a couple of things that I think really illustrate the connection. The first thing is that in 2013, well, first of all, I'll just say that here in Nova Scotia, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, a good chunk of our community are employed in the service sector. So low wage jobs, restaurants, coffee shops, this sort of thing. And a lot of that's non-union also. So in 2013, there was the Just Us company had a couple of outlets in Halifax that were ununionized, but frequented by many of us in the queer community and in the progressive community at large. A couple of their employees, however, which we didn't know, were being badly exploited on the job, treated really horribly, and so opted for union, and they had a union drive, and the two key organizers were trans men who were subsequently fired from their job by one of the more progressive employers in a co-op employer in Halifax. They subsequently went on. They didn't quit on it. They fought, and they won the union at Just Us. They won, and they got their jobs back, although they quit the next day. So, but then the Just Us, and so anyways, the point is that through organizing, they were able to achieve some control over the conditions in their workplace. They got benefits, they got an increase in wages, they got a more fair share of tips, and they got more control over scheduling. All of these things improved the lives of a mostly queer workforce at Just Us. So there's more to that story, but this is it was a really inspiring struggle that lasted about a year. But they stuck with it. The other thing is on the socialist side of things, and I want to point out the example of Cuba, which has kind of gone from a pretty homophobic socialist society in the 1960s to being one where the Center for for Sex Education, which is run by Mariela Castro, provides education on sexuality and gender identity across the country, and also provides access to free transition for every transgendered person in Cuba who wants it. So this is what a socialist society can achieve, which is to remove all of those barriers, if the will is there, remove all of the barriers that queer people are facing, trans people are facing under our current system, under rainbow capitalism. So if there is a better future, that's the one that I see. So this is why class consciousness and the willingness to struggle for revolutionary transformation is really important for queer people, in my view.
Thank you for that, Chris. You know, this question, and also another one that came in that's very similar about how identity for LGBTQI2S people, how it ties into the class struggle. And I think that there has been a long tradition of separation between LGBT identity and class struggle. And I think people are beginning to, I think more and more people realize that we are among some of the most marginalized people because we suffer from marginalization even in our own homes sometimes. And, you know, as somebody who has been active in the queer struggle for most of my life, I also know that a lot of organizations that provide a lot of support for your identity, you know, where you could go to pride parades, you could go and go to events where you would get rainbow stickers and things like that, but they won't be able to, you know, help you out in any way in terms of getting jobs or finding a housing, or they're not really concerned with these material needs that a lot of queer youth have, that I had a lot when I was young and growing up and among homophobic, transphobic people. So I think that we have to also remember that queer people also have needs like housing and education and healthcare, you know, and we can't, we're not just sexuality and gender identity are who we are, but we're also human. And I think that it's something we need to emphasize when it comes to this question of queer identity combining with class struggle. Stephen or Jen, does anybody else want to chime in? Stephen, go ahead.
So just on your last point, for me, the thing is that you know, we can't do it alone. We see in a whole number of our identities how this thing called identity politics, rather than working class politics, is very good at dividing the working class, and therefore dividing what we need to do together to actually reverse the damage that's been done since, I don't know, 1850, essentially. So I guess I want to make it more personal and say that part of what we need to do is work within our workplaces. And if we're able to organize unions, and if we're able within unions to link up to the Pink Triangle Committee or the Rainbow Committee or whatever, in order to begin to build a base so we're not, you know, alone in this struggle. One of the things that Jen and I, if I can speak for you, Jen, have discovered is, you know, as two out queers in a public sector worker club, that we're, even though not all of us in that club are, you know, organized into a union, we feed off of each other and we feel at home in this kind of organizing work where we have very clear political objectives, but we live in the real world, as you say, Kieran, and we operate in that world, and we're able to build strength together as working class members. And just to put a plug for the Communist Party, and to figure out how we can all work on this so it doesn't get trapped in our particular identity, but is that our identity is part of what makes us strong in, as you know, as people fighting imperialism, as people fighting for a socialist Canada, and so on and so on. And not too coherent, but that's my thoughts.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Absolutely. We do live in the real world. We live in the same material world as heterosexual people, as cisgender people. And we have the same material needs as any other human being. And I think that that's one of the issues that sometimes liberal discourse can, hide that fact. We do have a couple more questions. Marianne, do you want to come on and share some question with us?
Yes, so I will translate in English. We have one question in French in the chat. So how do the panelists see the economic structure connected with the social hierarchy and class and race? How do you connect all those struggles together and those structures?
Thank you. That's a great question. So basically the connections between class, race, and sexuality, as I understand it. Yeah, does anybody want to take that on? Jen, do you want to go? Do you want to start? Okay. Basically, I think that I'll chime in before anybody else does. I think that, as somebody who is marginalized on race, gender, sexuality, and class, coming from a working class background, I mean, I can speak from my perspective. I think that we have to, it's a constant struggle to highlight on all different sides for me that these things matter to each and every different group of, individuals. Sometimes there's a blind spots for people. And I feel like there are people who become, who want to erase the idea that that we experience certain things as women or femme identified people. And then there's some people who kind of don't realize that there are racialized issues, and there are, and I'm not even Black or Indigenous, but that, as a person of color, there are issues that there are perspective. We're always living under a white gaze, especially in the West. And then of course, gender and sexuality, there's a lot of heterosexism in the world, and a lot of it is just kind of accepted. It's just kind of the normal, the default way of being. So as a queer communist, you end up, queer communist of color especially, you end up navigating all those aspects of your identity together. But the communist part is actually where it unites everything, because communism is about achieving a level of equality and lack of exploitation. And I think that that's something that's core, that's universal, regardless of your gender, regardless of your race and everything, that we're all exploited, that we're all living in an oppressive system of capitalism. And I think that that's something that really has the power to unite people. And if we actually look at those things, it doesn't mean that we don't have those other perspectives as women, as queer people, as racialized people. It means that we keep those perspectives, as well as remember that the thing that really can unite everybody across these divides, so-called divides, is our class consciousness, and is our ability to recognize imperialism and capitalism as the primary contradictions. Go ahead, Jen.
Well, and just to touch on that too, Kieran, I agree. I think, when we talk about the nuances or the uniquely specific struggle within the working class as it pertains to LGBTIQ2S, we're really just highlighting the fact that we're living under imperialism and capitalism, right? The working class has already been sort of forced into these little super oppressed groups of people, whether it's based on gender, race, sexual orientation, etc. So I think we outlined quite a bit of statistical stuff in a high level way, of course, about the unique struggles within the super oppression around our segment of the working class, right? But to your point, Kieran, we're always still, as communists, and just because we're queer communists doesn't mean that we're going to buy into these identity politics type of aspects. But we also recognize that this is the conditions that we're living within. We are, as queers, forced further out into the margins. We do have more barriers put in place, and just as racialized folks do as well, just as women do as well. And I think, the idea of class consciousness being the unifying factor is absolutely what we're about. Like, this is exactly what we're about. But we're also wanting to make sure that we're educating other comrades and educating other people that we are not diverting and steering away from our class consciousness and our perspective of the working class unity and solidarity among all of the working class. But in order to do that, we need to recognize that there are absolutely unique struggles among the working class based on your hyper marginalization due to living under capitalism and imperialism. And we wouldn't be good communists unless we took that into perspective. And that's something I just like to put out there. But thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jen. Yeah, and I think that we have to recognize, for people who might want to just ignore identity altogether, that people don't stop being queer. People don't stop being women, you know, people don't stop being racialized. These are identity markers that are whatever you might want to call them and however they get socially constructed. But we don't stop being those things. We don't stop experiencing the world as those things, as those identities. And we do have to recognize, as Jen said, that these are how people experience the world, how the working class experiences the world. And we have to meet them where they are, kind of thing. So we have Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen.
So I just wanted to add that, you know, I was invited to join the Communist Party by a colleague of mine who used to co-chair meetings with me in my union. And what the Communist Party has actually helped me do is like navigate some of these issues. Like I have so many barriers in my mind because of who I am. And because, you know, I do have some income. And I, you know, like I'm a white cisgendered gay guy. And that's pretty much the top of the heap in terms of the queer community. But I'm a worker and I'm have a commitment to you know, international socialism. And it's the Communist Party and my own club particularly that helps me navigate and begin to understand what I could do, what I can do. And it, you know, I don't know, it's like a really important point to me that I'm not alone in this, that we're in it together. And, you know, it's not going to end. Like we might not achieve, you know, a socialist state before the end of next year, like just saying. Like it may take a little while, but being together really helps me. And it helps me as a queer activist. It helps me as a like big union activist. It helps me in my daily life. And I just wanted to say that. I don't know if it's on topic, but there you go.
Thank you, Stephen. Chris, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Just unmute. There we go. Unmuted. Yep. So I just wanted to say, first of all, that there's almost always an economic basis for every form of oppression, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sex, all of it. And I touched on this at the beginning of piece. I was talking about how the well, let me put it this way: if you want to subject somebody to super exploitation, I think Jen was using that term, super exploitation, extra exploitation, right? You get exploited worse than other people. Not that there's ever a good form of exploitation. There's not. But then you have to come up with a reason for why this is a legitimate thing to do. Why is it legitimate to pay a person of color half of what you're going to pay a person who's white? Why is it legitimate that you're paying a woman 60 cents on the dollar for every man that gets it? So, and the crude and simple answer is they're inferior. They deserve it. They're not worthwhile. They aren't worthy to be full members of this society. That's the nexus. That's what happens with racialized people. That's what happens with queer people. That's what happens with women. There is an ideology of oppression and hate that gets used to put a boot on your neck and to make you willing to work for less in order to get that boot off your neck. It also serves a function of terrorizing people who are witnessing that kind of oppression and convince you to say, thank God that isn't me. I'll keep my head down. So what we say is that it's the oppression that's got to go, and we got to chop that boot off at the ankle of capitalism. So that's how I see the intersections of race, class, and gender. And also, it's not ID poll. The difference between this and ID politics is that it's just what Joe Biden is doing right now, right? You have to have X percentage of women, you have to have X percentage of queers, and so on and so forth, but it doesn't do anything to change the content. That approach sucks. There's also just one other question that's been raised, and I'll speak to it if I may, and it's about how do you convince blue-collar workers, I think any workers. I want to just point you towards the movie Pride and gays, lesbians and gays support the minors. That was some kick-ass, hard organizing, and it was done by communists who basically were responsible for building solidarity with the striking miners who were fighting Thatcher, and went into mining communities as queers. And boy, I tell you, it was not easy, okay? But the result is that next Pride Parade, there were busloads of miners that showed up to show their support. This is a question of winning that fight on the basis of class solidarity. So they may not like you, they may not want to, they may not approve, but at the end of the day, you want to make it clear that you are an ally. All right, and that you're solid and that you're going to stand beside them when push comes to shove. That's the dynamic that will change it for you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, what was the name of that movie again? Or the book or movie? No, movie, right?
Yep, it was called Pride. And just so everybody knows, I can't say this often enough, the person who organized Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners was Mark Ashton, who was General Secretary of the YCL of Great Britain. So
thank you.
Anyways, yeah, Pride is the name of the movie.
I also recommend that people, if you haven't already done so, should read Leslie Feinberg. They were a great activist, communist, genderqueer, trans activist, Jewish, working class, socialist, and just they have amazing writings. And I would definitely recommend looking them up. And there's some of their writings available freely on their website. So absolutely. Marianne, please go ahead.
Je pense que la discussion est vraiment intéressante. Puis un point que j'aimerais faire, c'est qu'il y a souvent dans les discours dominants là, sur le communisme, cette idée que les communistes, on penserait que le socialisme, en fait, va tout régler, puis que la lutte se termine là. Puis au fond, un peu comme, c'est vrai ce que Chris a expliqué, le fait que notre identité sexuelle, notre identité de genre, notre race sont utilisées pour la discrimination, puis en fait empêcher une certaine unité. Mais c'est pas n'importe quelle identité qui est utilisée. Le système raciste, le système hétérosexiste, le système patriarcal, c'est des systèmes qui existent bien avant le capitalisme et qui existent depuis extrêmement longtemps. Ce sont des systèmes structuraux et c'est pour ça que, comme on l'a dit plus tôt, en tant que matérialiste, les idées, les préjugés ne sont pas à la source de nos oppressions. C'est ces systèmes-là qui sont à la source de nos oppressions. Ils existent dans les sociétés de classe et le socialisme ne règle pas nécessairement l'entièreté de nos luttes de façon mécanique. Notre prétention, c'est que le socialisme jette les bases, en fait, pour notre libération et la lutte va continuer. Ça ne s'arrête pas simplement, on a fait la révolution, on a socialisé les moyens de production, il n'y existe plus d'oppression. Donc, la lutte va continuer. Et c'est pour ça aussi qu'en tant que communiste, on dit tout le temps, il n'y aura pas de libération tant que les systèmes oppressifs, tous les systèmes oppressifs, c'est ensemble. Il n'y aura pas de libération queer sans libération de classe et pas de libération de classe sans libération queer. Ça va ensemble. Ce sont des luttes communes, mais pas seulement communes parce qu'on a besoin d'unité, communes parce qu'elles sont opposées à des systèmes connectés ensemble. Le capitalisme a modifié le patriarcat d'une façon particulière. Donc, il y a un modèle patriarcal dans le capitalisme, mais il précède, bien entendu, comme je disais tantôt, le capitalisme comme tel. Puis souvent, c'est triste d'entendre, en fait, dans les universités un peu partout, il y a vraiment une diabolisation de notre discours, mais notre discours est beaucoup plus nuancé. Je pense que vous l'avez vu aujourd'hui, que on voit la lutte intersectionnelle, on voit la lutte qui continue, mais on voit les systèmes comme étant structuraux. On n'est pas discriminé parce qu'on a des cheveux roux, c'est sur la base du sexe, c'est sur la base de la race, c'est sur la base de capacité aussi. Donc, c'est une vision vraiment intégrée qu'on a et pas mécanique non plus. Alors, voilà.
Merci, Marianne. So we have one more comrade who was going to join us today, but unfortunately for health reasons, she couldn't come. So I would like to read some of her presentation that she had prepared. So this will just be a couple of minutes. Corporate profits versus people's needs. This means that unemployment and part-time precarious work is going to grow as fall gives way to winter and hard times get much harder for working people. Obviously, some of it was written before. Hardest hit are women, racialized people, youth, and low-wage part-time and precarious workers who are being pushed out of the workforce into poverty and dependence as they watch their savings, their homes, and futures go up in smoke. Meanwhile, profits are growing by leaps and bounds. The 20 richest people in Canada increased their personal wealth by $37 billion since the pandemic began, an average of almost $2 billion each. These members of the 1% include the Thompsons, Westons, Irvings, Bronfmans, Jim Pattison, John Couteau, and many others. Corporate profits have jumped too. According to Oxfam, 32 of the world's largest companies increased their profits by $109 billion in 2020, while 500 million people were pushed into poverty in the fallout. But that won't stop 25 of the S&P's most profitable corporations, who will pay out an estimated $378 billion to their shareholders in 2020. Meanwhile, capitalist governments around the globe have handed out trillions of dollars in corporate bailouts, and they're not finished. This is the real source of mounting public deficits and debt. The pandemic itself has become a source of profits, including price gouging on food supplies, on pharmaceuticals, and online technology. Now the race is on to develop a vaccine that Big Pharma hopes to patent and sell to the world, reaping windfall profits. The alternative to united action by the banks, the corporations, and right-wing governments, which are already demanding an end to benefits for the unemployed, plus austerity measures for the working population to reduce the deficit, is united action by working people. The best way to reduce the deficit is to slash the bloated military spending, tax the corporations and the wealthy, and put the country back to work with good jobs, better wages, rising living standards, and a COVID vaccine that's free and accessible to all. A people's coalition can unite labor, women, youth, the unemployed, the unorganized, Indigenous people, racialized people, and immigrants, environmentalists, peace activists, and all those affected by the pandemic, unemployment, and economic crisis. A people united in struggle can compel fundamental change, as history shows. A people's recovery can be won with a united struggle by the labor and people's movements and all those committed to fight for a program of action such as this. So now I'm just going to go over a little bit of the Communist Party's recovery plan. The Communist Party is demanding jobs and incomes for all the unemployed and underemployed as a right. The government must act for real reform of the Employment Insurance Act to make employment insurance non-contributory and accessible to all the unemployed and precarious workers for the full duration of unemployment at 90% of previous earnings. We demand the federal government act to raise the minimum wage to $20 in every province and territory across Canada. We demand substantially increased pensions, fully accessible at age 60. We demand the introduction of a guaranteed annual livable income to put a floor under everyone unable to work. This is the right to live with dignity, not on the subsistence incomes delivered by provincial governments across Canada. We demand the federal and provincial governments act decisively to protect frontline workers in public and private sector employment who are risking their lives in unsafe workplaces, including long-term care facilities, public transportation and public services, meat packing plants, and food processing, production, and sales. Workers need legislation and enforcement of the right to refuse unsafe work, the right to 14 annual paid sick days, and the right to essential protections such as PPE. We also demand that the federal government actively intervene in the economy to create jobs by expanding social programs and public services, expanding value-added manufacturing and secondary industry, building affordable social housing, and retrofitting provincial and municipal infrastructure using green technology. Instead of bailouts for the airlines, we say bring Air Canada back as a publicly owned and democratically controlled crown corporation, along with Bombardier, which is rich with public bailouts over the decades. We say nationalize the energy industry, close the tar sands, and develop renewable energy to reduce carbon emissions, and create full-time, well-paid, permanent employment for working people to restart the economy. We demand full employment, policies, equity, and a future for youth in every part of the country. So that's just part of her presentation. I thought I would read that out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We do have this conversation that will be an ongoing conversation. We invite you to leave your comments. And do the speakers have anything in closing they want to say before we wrap up?
I want to say that we should all stand by because there's more of this coming. You know, we will do this again. The Pride Commission has already got our hats on, and we're going to blow ourselves away. We hope you join us.
Thank you, Stephen. Absolutely. We are reinvigorated to bring more webinars to you on more topics. This was the first of many that are coming up. Chris, go ahead.
Yes. So I'm going to pop a link to a Facebook event page for my show this evening. It's called Priscilla, Queen of the Highlands. We do this once a year in Antigonish, and I'm going to tell you without any shame whatsoever that this is probably the best drag show east of Montreal. So you can, the cost for it, we're online this year. Normally we have it in a big venue. But we want to respect people's health this year, so we're doing it online. You can purchase tickets by sending an email, and you get your registration link in exchange. Tickets are $10 per person. If you're in a COVID house of 4 people, or you want to have a watch party of 4 people, it's $25. So, and this all goes to support queer organizing in my community here. So anyways, I'm going to post that just now. You can follow it, check it out, see what you think, and hopefully I'll see some of you tonight.
That's awesome. That sounds like fun, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will post the link in our YouTube chat. Jen, do you have anything to wrap us up with? And also Marianne?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I'm really glad we got to do this today. Of course, I always feel like there's so much more to say. There's some questions that we unfortunately didn't get to in the chat, but it's really good to have those questions there anyways, and certainly that might be able to help shape our future discussions on this platform. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and keep the struggle real. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And I'm sorry I couldn't have my mustache on because I lost all of my little mustache apps from Zoom. I just tried to do it and I'm like, where's my stash, man?
The video filters, yes.
Yeah, my video filters. I can't find any of them. But anyway, just, imagine.
Jen has been playing with all the
we're
video
gonna see some drag stuff with.
Yes, Chris's show. Awesome.
So,
Maria, go ahead, Stephen.
So maybe we could ask Jay to post that link for tonight's show.
I just did.
On the Facebook page. I can't find it. Okay,
okay.
Good. I'm glad
posted it on
there it is. Perfect.
Okay. Marianne, go ahead, please.
Mais moi, je voulais juste remercier les camarades qui ont sorti leur français. C'était vraiment apprécié de tous les participants qui parlent français, justement, de tous les francophones. Bien sûr, on va essayer de faire plus de contenu francophone. C'était une première, je pense, contenu conjugué et ça a été une belle expérience. Alors, merci à tous les participants, à tous les panélistes, puis à très bientôt. On va remettre ça.
OK, merci à toi.
Merci, Marianne. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will be doing more of these. Thank you to our tech person, Jay Watts, our central organizer for the party. Thank you very much for making sure everything runs smoothly. And thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the Pride Commission of the Communist Party of Canada for hosting and for organizing this. So join us again next time. See you later.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Salut.
Salut.